You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This month we are continuing our conversation from a year ago about the experience of having a disability or a chronic illness and being goth, as well as just existing in the world. We are going to talk about goth specifically. We're going to talk about some problematic elements of goth culture or community, some of the ways in which the aesthetics and behaviors of goths have caused some pain. We're also going to talk about how goth has become a refuge and shelter for people of all different types and all different life experiences. We'll look at some of the systemic issues that create difficulties for healthcare workers and people with disabilities. And we're also going to just have a good time with each other. We talk about everything from witchcraft to content creation. It's a lot of fun. I think this is a really enjoyable episode, and I'm happy to share this with you. So let's get started with introductions. Let's do just a brief snapshot for who our guests are this time around and where you are from. Carol, let's start with you.
Hello, I'm Carol. I live in the Scottish Highlands, but you can tell from the accent that I'm not Scottish. My Instagram is Domesticated Goth for my personal gothy account, Architecturally Gothic for my architectural photography account, and Dragon and Cat Designs for my art, and that's my sort of new business. I have a blog at Domesticated Goth at Blogspot. That's most of my social media. I have a Facebook account as Domesticated Goth as well. And a YouTube, but I never used YouTube. I made one video and then aborted that plan entirely. I don't know what to say, but hello.
Hello and welcome. We'll go with that. Helen.
Hi, my name is Helen McEvany. I have Facebook, which you can reach me on if you feel like it. And I also have an Instagram that is Lady McEvany. And that's a weird last name to say and spell, I've noticed for a lot of people. So that's MacEvinney. And because we're talking about illnesses and neurodivergences, I figured I'd give a brief summary of what I'm working with. At the age of 16, I was diagnosed with major recurrent depression as well as generalized anxiety disorder. At the age of 20, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia syndrome, seropositive rheumatoid arthritis, and systemic lupus erythematosus. And then recently, at the age of 24, I just turned 25, I was diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, and borderline agoraphobia. But I'm really glad to be back here, and thank you for having me to talk about such an important topic.
It is nice to have you back.
Shall I list what conditions and things I have?
Yeah, feel free.
Okay, I have Asperger's, autistic spectrum disorder. Hans Asperger was a Nazi, so we don't like using the name Asperger's, but that's what the clinical diagnosis is. I have ADHD. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I have some sort of generalized anxiety disorder. They haven't figured out which kind of anxiety I have because I have too many. I have probably got obsessive compulsive personality disorder, but trying to get an assessment for that is being something of a nightmare. I've been referred by my GP, but it's going somewhere close to nowhere. I have dyspraxia. I have hypermobile joints. I think I've listed everything.
Amy?
Yeah, hi. I'm Amy. I can be found on Twitter as Amy Smith, Autism Advocacy and Me. And I also have a Facebook page related to that, which has been dormant for a long time. But as of this podcast episode will be up again because I will post this on. I, as the name implies, I am on the autism spectrum. Somewhere I was diagnosed with Asperger's, much like Carolyn was, but of course that's a rather obsolete diagnosis these days. So I just refer to myself as autistic. I also have been living with single-sided deafness for most of my life, and I kid you not when I say it switched at one point. I have a rather bizarre medical history with my hearing, and which will be corrected with surgery sometime late this year, early next year. And as you can hear from my accent, I'm from Sydney, Australia.
And I just want to wish Tanya and Michelle the best. They were unable to join us this time around, but I just wanted to say that you're in our thoughts, and we hope you are doing well. And I guess I can mention from my end, I think the primary diagnosis that gives me the most difficulty in life is ADHD. I have some social anxiety, but that's about it. My wife does have chronic depression and also generalized anxiety disorder. So that's what she deals with. And okay, great. Thank you all for being here. This is, I'm very glad to have you back. It's always wonderful to speak with all of you and have some friends on and hang out. Especially now that I'm going crazy all by myself in my house. And I guess speaking of going crazy all by yourself in your house, how has life changed for you, for better or worse, during this sort of global pandemic, self-isolation that we're dealing with?
I'm actually handling quarantine fantastically.
Hmm.
I'm an introvert on top of all my other shenanigans, so it feels very normal and comfortable for me to stay in my home and kind of be with myself.
Hmm.
And I do all of my interacting online as it is. Due to my compromised immune system, I started personal quarantine back in March, basically as soon as COVID hit my county, which I forgot to mention, I am in Washington State, USA, so over on the Pacific coast. I didn't really go out much to begin with, so nothing's really different. I'm really grateful, one, that I'm living with my mom, but also that her work was really on top of getting them able to work from home quickly because she works in a standard office building, which is just as air circulating and unhygienic as the next.
Hmm.
So, when I have had to go out, which is really rare, having less people in crowded spaces and having people visibly distance themselves from me has actually done really well for my mental health as far as my anxiety and just general dislike of being in big crowds. The only real detriment that I have seen is that now I can't do the work that my counselor and I have been working on for my agoraphobia because it's not safe for me to just practice going outside my house. The most I can do is there are some family members who I do feel comfortable going over and social distancing with, which is still really a comfort zone, so it doesn't really exercise my agoraphobia very much. Um, but other than that, it's been perfectly fine. And then, there's how the US is handling the pandemic in particular, which is doing horrors for my anxiety. But other than that, I'm doing all right.
What about you, Amy?
Yeah, so it's a little similar with Helen. I would describe myself as more of an ambivert. I am, for the most part, an introvert, but then give me the right conditions, and I just love being around people. But that's the thing; there have to be the very specific conditions. It's interesting actually that in my city, a few things were happening kind of at the same time that meant that even before COVID kind of kicked in, my life is already starting to kind of wind down with socializing. I was focusing on picking up a bigger study schedule, so I already wasn't going to be going out as much as I usually would. The venue where we pretty much held like nearly all of our events in the goth and alternative scene ended up like kind of there's this change of hands, this conflict between like the venue manager and the guy who ran the pub, and so this falling out happened, and they left, and that actually was rather devastating to the whole of my city because it was a well-known venue. And so already there were like a couple of events that were winding down as a result. And then you have like you have this thing where like in Australia we did actually, after a few bungles, because there were a few bungles, we did lockdown, and we locked down pretty well. I'm so sorry, America. We feel really bad for you over here, but they did kind of let things go a bit, which then brought on a second wave, which means that one of the states is now on probably the strictest lockdown we've ever kind of known, and I'm so glad I'm not in that state. But it's actually been pretty alright because I'm focusing mostly on my studies. I'm able to connect with friends online, and it feels a bit better because it's like everyone else is going through this. So if I'm staying at home, I'm not feeling bad that this kind of anxiety that can happen when you're on the autism spectrum of, are they not inviting me along because they don't like me, or is it or are they forgetting about me, or am I missing out on something? It's, oh hell, we're all in this together. So like this is fine. Like I'm not missing out on anything. We're all at home most of the time. And I have been going out just to do a couple of things. That's grocery shopping and attend a fan and belly dance class that's run by someone who's involved in the goth scene as well.
Oh.
And so that's also been like really cool. I think the fact that I live in a town just outside of Sydney has really helped because we're quite, it's not like we're isolated, but we're certainly not packed in like a lot of people in Sydney are. Like we have a house that's near the bush that managed to escape the worst of the bushfires that had happened at the end of last year, because that was a thing that happened as well. Like before COVID,
terrible.
like yes, it was awful, and there was so many times that I thought I have to grab a bag and leave my house and start from scratch.
Wow.
But that thankfully didn't happen. So even before COVID, like a lot of things were kind of being put into perspective for a lot of us. And I think I was definitely affected by that. So yeah, this whole thing's been borderline spiritual because it's kind of like made me go, okay, I can actually kind of reset and just be a bit more comfortable and uncomfortable within myself in good and bad ways, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that forced confrontation has brought out both the best and the worst in a lot of people.
On the whole, me personally, I think lockdown has been actually relatively beneficial to my mental health. I think, echoing what a lot of people said before, I found that basically an introvert isn't quite the right word. I'm introverted and I don't really like socializing in any large amount, but I think with me I just get social burnout very rapidly, partly because the ADHD makes me rather hyperverbal and very energetically social, which is very tiring, and then having to analyze the conversation intellectually because I've got the intuitive empathy of a lump of rock, makes it very difficult for me to socialize for an extended period of time. I'm not sure if that's true introversion or just really the symptoms of my autism, but certainly the lack of expectations now for in-person socializing has definitely benefited me. I was one of those people who always felt obliged if I was invited to go along to something that I'm very terrible at saying no, I'm not having a good people day. I always feel like I'm putting people out if I say no. So it's been nice to not have that sort of expectation. University, I'm studying history and archaeology. That's my second degree. Glutton for punishment, clearly a masochist. Has been online so far, which I have been struggling with. The online lectures, that's fine. It's more, I have probably rather terrible internet connection, and I think quite fortunate this evening that my internet is working sufficiently for me to engage in this interview. And it's been very difficult to try and follow along the lectures, and then suddenly my internet cuts out because I live somewhere rural, and the upgrade for us having actual proper broadband that's at a decent speed was, of course, cancelled due to the COVID-19 outbreak. So it meant that and then everyone was trying to use very limited amount of internet. So it was causing even more issues. So that was quite a problem. And then my research project, because I was doing a research project on some local history, because doing my landscape archaeology module, and I was looking into the medieval and pre-medieval archaeology of the embankment along the river near where I live. That would require a trip to the archives, and the archives were shut. So that sort of made it very difficult for me to do that project. And in the end, I just had to accept a generic pass for that module. They just passed everyone on the module, like COVID happened, you get a blanket pass, which I find rather frustrating because I was trying to get decent grades because this time around I want to prove to myself I can get a first. So it's personal, let down rather than anything that's jeopardizing my degree. But considering I had a lot of mental health issues in my previous degree studies, and I very nearly didn't graduate, and I certainly didn't graduate with the first, that it was something that was important to me to prove to myself that I didn't have to have the yearly cycle of A grades in September and October, then gradually decreasing until you get to summer and I'm barely passing things because I'm just so burnt out. I was hoping I'm on proper medication for my ADHD now. I'm in counselling. I'm in the perfect place now to really study well and do well. And then to have COVID come along and be like, no, we're interrupting. It's been a bit stressful, but that's the only serious negative to the lockdown situation has been my studies. I have been really enjoying how much less sensory overload I experience going outside now. Well, not now, because I'm current present because I decided to get back to more of a normal, but during lockdown, it was so much quieter. All the construction work nearby ceased for a good few months. And I have very bad sensory processing disorder, and one of the bigger things I have an issue with is sounds. So the fact that we've had a flood defence scheme being built locally, a very large new housing estate that's making my little village into part of the greater local conurbation, which I'm not so keen on the environmental grounds, but that's another rant. That was going on. We've had utilities being put in, all of this happening around just before lockdown came in, and then it stopped. Things were quiet, and I couldn't hear diggers or earth movers anymore, and it wasn't that sort of cha-cha-cha-cha-cha as they sort of drill into the ground and things. It was just quiet. And it was the airport. I live not too far from an airport, far enough away that it's not super, super loud, but I'm near enough the flight path to hear things. And we've also got some RAF bases in the general wide area, which means you get like fighter jets going over, which are very loud, and helicopters coming in. And I am not a fan of great big military helicopters flying in low, that sort of thundering engine sound. That was gone. That was quiet. And traffic was reduced because the lockdown in Scotland was very strict and there was no non-essential journeys. So you weren't allowed to drive anywhere unless you were going to the shop or the doctor. And the shops you were allowed to go to was only food shops, pet food shops, and I think there's a few other categories. But, recreational shopping and shopping for things that were considered non-essential was now had to do all online. So we had more delivery lorries and more delivery vehicles, but far less traffic. So that was a lot quieter. And obviously people were working from home, so there wasn't the usual rush hour traffic. So again, that was quieter. It's like, it's quiet. It's peaceful. It's nice. I don't have this constant thrum of human existence in the background.
Mhm.
Modern life is very loud.
Yeah.
And for someone like me who hears every single tiny sound, it's just frustrating to have that constantly, and suddenly it's gone. It was just like, I didn't realise just how present it was until it wasn't there anymore. It's like when I go up into the mountains and I'm like, oh, it's quiet here. But I didn't have to go up any mountains.
Right.
Well, I like mountains, but it's less effort than climbing a mountain.
Yeah.
So I like that, and social distancing has been wonderful. You don't get crowded in, which is another thing I find very stressful. Supermarkets, minimal 2-meter distancing, spaced out queuing. We're Brits, we know how to queue anyway, but this is spread out queuing, which is far better than just regular queuing. And the supermarket has these always one-way systems, and everything's neat and orderly, and you just go one round way. You don't have to think about where's the stuff in the supermarket, because you're all going on this little zigzag path. So you'll come across what you want to buy eventually, so you don't have to worry about where it is. And just go all the way around zigzag and back to the checkout. So it's all very orderly. I don't have to think too hard. And I find supermarkets incredibly overwhelming. So thinking about anything in the supermarket is very difficult for me, because it's loud, bright, and I know you go there at night because they put the lights down after 9 o'clock at night, which is nice and less glaring for my poor eyes, because walking around in the supermarket with sunglasses makes you look like a shoplifter, and I learnt that very rapidly.
Oh, goodness.
So it's now we have to wear masks. That's a downside for me, sensory-wise, because it sort of presses on my face and I find it uncomfortable. But it's better than spreading diseases, so I'll live with it. And there's goth ones. There's so many goth ones. I've got a whole array of goth ones. I'm really hoping we get to keep wearing them soon, like into the future, because I like these. Now I get to wear skulls on my skull. So I've been enjoying that.
Oh my god!
Extra skulls, yay! So there's quite a few advantages to things. I've been enjoying the extra wildlife, because the deer are no longer sort of terrified of the traffic for a while. So they were all sort of just... there was deer running behind my house.
Yes, that's absolutely been a thing here too. It's been amazing.
It's just nice to have animals that aren't just hiding all the time. But there have been 2 major disadvantages for me, but they aren't, for me personally, they're for people I know. My dad is very, very immunocompromised. He has a whole plethora of health issues. He's been recovering from chemotherapy, and he has pretty much no immune system. So he has been in as shielding as one can shield, and that has certainly been quite stressful for me, because I've been concerned about his general safety. He lives somewhere very remote indeed. He is somewhat of a hermit and lives on a Welsh mountainside in the middle of absolute nowhere, which is absolutely perfect for him as a person, and very fortunate in this pandemic, because if there's no one up the mountain, there's no one to give him COVID. But you can't live on a mountainside eternally, and with a lot of shops being shut and things, there's obviously delivery drivers coming back and forth for him, so you have to have a quarantining items protocol. So everything that came into his house had to be quarantined. The objects had to be quarantined for 48 hours before he could handle them. And he had to have, like I said, boxes outside for his deliveries to come in, which means he couldn't have perishable goods once the weather got warm enough for that to be a concern. There's all sorts of issues like that. I mean, he's semi-self-sufficient. He can get a lot from his garden, but it's not everything. And the bigger issue for him is that he had a roof leak, and due to the restrictions with COVID-19, he couldn't get his roof mended because construction work was cancelled under our lockdown rules. So that's been a bit stressful. And now there's a big backlog of repairs and everything that needs done. So him trying to find a builder to fix his roof before winter sets in, and we're already September pretty much, which is autumn as far as the UK is concerned. So that's a bit of a concern. And the other concern is that my partner is a nurse on what it was the COVID ward. When it was the COVID ward, it's been put back to the clinical decisions admissions unit. But for when we had high COVID numbers, it was the COVID ward. And that was very stressful for him. And he was coming back from work very frazzled. And obviously, he can't talk about what's going on too much because of patient confidentiality. But it was very clear from his demeanour that it was very stressful for him. The Westminster government has done a terrible job of dealing with COVID-19. Absolutely dire. And herd immunity. I was like, Are you insane?
Oh my god, the
No,
amount of talk about
this
that
doesn't
here
work
too.
like that.
No.
Yeah, I'm grateful I live in Australia where they didn't have that approach, but there's a lot of conspiracy loving hippies not too far from where I live, and some of them were arguing for that too, which is like,
Oh my god, I have a whole soapbox about that that's sitting in my list for the show notes, and I'm ready.
Yeah. Herd immunity is all fine
I
and
mean-
good, but it should be gained through immunization, not through
Death.
just giving each
Everybody
other the
getting
disease.
sick.
Yes.
It was horrible, and it took there was such a delay. There has been thousands of unnecessary deaths in the UK because the government acted so slowly, and then there was the whole issue of Dominic Cummings and the people in charge basically flouting all the lockdown rules. Most notably, recently, Boris Johnson went camping in Scotland. The Scottish people are inundated with tourists who can't go to Europe because of COVID restrictions, and the Highland infrastructure can't cope with infinite tourists from, because we are small villages scattered across hillsides with, yes, and then this sort of kind of conflict between requiring tourism for our economy in a recession, which I could like to blame half on COVID and half on Brexit.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Westminster government. Because Scotland did not vote for that. England voted for that.
That's a whole move. Yeah.
like, while we've had a similarly cynical sort of approach with, like, putting the economy first and that sort of thing, like, we're kind of lucky that we are a singular country, but yeah, that we've had some similar madnesses to do with, like, the different states. Like, there's hard borders, and then some of the media want to get rid of those hard borders, and then others, it's
My mother's Breton French, and I grew up in France for the first few years of my life, although I was born in England because of a very complicated and dysfunctional family situation. So my first language is French, and I grew up in a French-speaking household and spent a lot of time in France, and then lived permanently in the UK from the age of 4 onwards. I actually don't know how much time I spent in France because I was a toddler at the time, but it certainly, my upbringing had a lot of those ties to France, and it always got one foot to the other side of the channel. If that makes sense. So
I did want to ask, I guess, a general terminology question, because I think that's just relevant for people in general and the way we treat others, and it's around the terms that we use to describe various illnesses or disabilities. I've always seen it mentioned that we should use the term people with disability because it decentralizes the disability from the person. But I just saw recently I think it was Twitter, it might have been Reddit, but someone was arguing that to them, it was a pedantic distinction. They basically said, I'm autistic, and saying I'm a person with autism is just silly, and just call me autistic. So I wanted to...
I definitely see it as an autistic person. I think it depends on whether you use person first or descriptive language. I think depends on the nature of the disorder. If you have something that doesn't really impact like your core personality, like it's something, all disabilities are going to impact your life and your personality in some way or another, but where it isn't such a core aspect of who you are, then I think I can see why some people would prefer having the person first thing. So you're a person with whatever, because you first, and then disabilities not like so core. But with autism, it's your very neurology. It is your personality. It is who you are, and it's not something that can be separated from you. You can't make that distinction because I am autistic. It's so innate. It's the way I was born. It's the way my mind works. But trying to putting it the other way around, like I'm not Carolyn with autism. I am Carolyn, and I am autistic.
Yeah,
right.
I have such opinions on the whole, like, hearing you describe as like, to try and decentralize disability from the person, I am like, that just rubs me up the wrong way, because I'm like, we don't make these quibbles about nationality. We don't make these quibbles about, a person, for example, a person's ethnic identity. So if someone, say, is from the Assyrian community, they will say, I'm Assyrian, because that's a very defining characteristic of who they are. We don't, if someone describes themselves as a woman or a man or non-binary, or we don't turn around and say, no, you need to decentralize your gender identity from yourself. But as soon as the topic of disability comes up, is no, we must decentralize this from the person. And it's like, but you can't, because disability is very much about the person, like the person's day-to-day functioning. It might be their physicality, their neurology, their sensory, and it's not something you can exactly remove from a person. And I feel like the only reason why a lot of, and it's mostly from the abled, sort of the abled community, the reason why there seems to be such a push for decentralizing the disability from the person is because there is an inherently negative view of disability. It's this idea that disability is only a bad thing, whereas someone like myself or others in the disability communities were like, no, it's not that it's a bad thing, it's a thing. It is a thing that has bad and good, because that is what it is to be human. Now, beyond that, I would say that it is always up to the individual. Just like we would, ensure that we're getting pronouns correct, we should also ensure that for each individual person, we're getting how they would describe their disability as correct, and that's up to the person with the disability.
Right.
So, for example, like I describe myself as autistic and experiencing single-sided deafness. I don't identify as deaf because I didn't grow up in the deaf community. I wasn't born deaf. I acquired deafness through like my ear's just been weird. And, I grew up in the hearing world. I grew up with spoken language, and I grew up with a degree of hearing. So I don't identify as deaf because I'm not part of that community. But I am certainly, autistic. I certainly have that experience. I certainly, even though I wasn't diagnosed until adulthood, it did very much shape my life. And I think, so at the end of the day, it is up to the individuals, but this whole idea, again, and you can hear it in my voice, it's very, very irritating when they say that you need to decentralize this from the person, because you only desire to do that if you think the thing is bad. And I think that's why many in the disability community is like, no, it's not the thing is bad, the thing just is.
Right, exactly. Like, one of the things that I think is most powerful about my set of circumstances that I have personally is that I have grown to be such the most compassionate individual who is able to understand people on all sorts of different levels. I might not have been that way if it weren't for my depression, if it weren't for my anxiety, if it weren't for my CPTSD. I might not be the same person today. So seeing the different disabilities, neurodivergences, chronic illnesses as a bad thing only, that's a problem with the able community. That's not a problem with me or my friends. And a lot of my friends are really super compassionate about it. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up.
I hate this thing, the idea of autism is inherently bad. If it wasn't for my hyperfocus and special interests, I wouldn't be working on my second university degree and heading for a postgrad course.
Exactly.
So how the hell is that a bad thing? Like, there are plenty of good aspects to being autistic. People, it's weird that you're obsessed with class. Say that to me again when I'm working as a consultant in architectural history.
Right?
And heritage conservation. Tell me that again.
Yeah,
then.
no, I'm not the only autistic person in my family. I have a much younger sibling also on the spectrum, and they are, honestly, they're still in school, still a kid. And my mum had my sibling like when I was 19. Like this one was a complete surprise to the whole family. And they are honestly like they do have a lot of, like I guess you could say social naivete, and it's actually slightly because of that they're not yet jaded. Like I see so many kids their age, and my sibling is almost 10 years old, and I see so many kids their age, and I'm like, holy crap, they're jaded already. Like they're already, they're at that preteen stage, they're trying to be cool and all of that, and so they're very like guarded and jaded a little, and I'm like, my sibling tries to be cool but like doesn't pull it off because they're just too sweet. and they are like one of the most loveliest, sweetest, most compassionate people I've ever known. And I think part of, oh my god, honestly, I'm just like, it's like, you know that meme of like, they are pure and we must defend them,
protect them.
Yes, protect them at all costs. That is my sibling, 100%. And yeah, and it's partly because of their social naivete that they are like that, because they don't realize that, according to social rules, there are some people that you can't be kind to because, oh my gosh, that person, we don't like them. My siblings like just doesn't get that. They're just like, no, I just want the world to be, happy and shiny, and I mean, we do have to remind them sometimes, the world's not, happy, shiny, like rainbow farting unicorns. We wish it was, but you do have to be prepared for stuff. But we are the ones helping prepare the sibling for all that. And honestly, like I think my parents' approach has been like, we love the authentic person that this person is, and if autism is a part of that, then that's what it is. We wouldn't change it. And I think there's a lot of people can learn. Honestly, a lot of people can learn from my sibling. Obviously, I'm protecting their identity. They're a child. They deserve autonomy. They deserve privacy. But honestly, this sibling, I'm like, if more people could just look at their example, I think there'd be a lot more kinder people in the world. I adore them so much. Sorry, I gush about my sibling anytime I talk about them because like,
well, they deserve
we can learn
it
so much. They do.
I would say, in my personal experience as somebody autistic, it's not so much that I'm socially naive, it's just that I see straight through how illogical it is to have so many of these arbitrary social rules. They just don't make any sense.
Oh my god, thank you.
So what's the point? I don't know that they're there. I know that they're there. I just think they're silly. And I've been like that since I was very young. I'm like, and this is a rule, why? Which made me, of course, the difficult, challenging child that kept answering back because I kept asking questions. Yeah. But it's, it just seems that so many things are very, very arbitrary. And I just look at it and I'm just like, why? Why am I going along with this? I was writing recently an article for my blog on romantic goth, and it sort of brought this to mind some meme somewhere. I was like, oh, let's make wizard cloaks and Victorian dresses socially acceptable. I'm like, why does it matter whether it's socially acceptable or not?
Yeah.
If we all did what we wanted, then the social acceptability problem would be sort of self-negated. So just wear what you want, and then if everybody did that, then we'd all wear what we want, and we wouldn't be pining for wishing what we could want to wear would be socially acceptable, because it would all just be acceptable because we wouldn't have a rule about it. Why is there a rule about it? Why is there a rule saying that I shouldn't wear a bustle gown on the bus? I mean, except for the practicality of wearing the bustle. I mean, that's probably a bad example. But, you know, why is there a rule saying that it's a bad idea to go out shopping dressed like that? Like, what am I hurting? Except in their case, so I did actually just think about that, you know, the practicality of fitting a bustle skirt on the bus would
be really awkward and hard to do, yeah.
I've worn 3 petticoats for a Gothic Lolita outfit on a coach. I should know better. But it's like, it's sort of, where practicality aside, why not? Why is it considered over the top to wear this shopping?
Right.
Like, what am I doing harmful because I decided that today I want to wear a Gothic Lolita outfit or a Victorian inspired outfit or something? Like, why do people care?
Yeah.
Like,
Right?
it's projecting the wrong image. It's like, but no, it's projecting the right image. It's projecting me and my interests, things historical and spooky. So why is this stop making rules? They're pointless. Leave things alone.
Yes.
I think we can end the podcast right there. We're done. I think that's it.
Yeah.
You've done it.
Stop
making
rules.
rules. It's dumb. Goodbye. Oh my God. Yes.
I'm with you on that, Carolyn. I'm like, honestly, I think that was part of what attracted me to goth as well. But with some of that is like, oh, you can't look like that. Why not? Like,
right?
But
Watch
I want
me.
to. Yeah, exactly. And it was just, oh my God. Okay, so it was for me. Like, here I was bullied so badly in primary school. I had the worst bullying, and I have I shared this before. I actually did appear on a TV show a few years ago with my parents where we discussed autism diagnosis, and I was an autistic person who'd been diagnosed later in life, whereas we had another autistic person who'd been diagnosed as a child, and what our quality of life was, with our diagnoses. And, spoiler alert, we both had the same shitty experiences regardless. The 90s was not a great time to be an autistic kid, I tell you.
Mm-mm.
But, what happened was I was called all kinds of names. Like, I wasn't, looking alternative in the least. I mean, I was 8 till about 12 when I was bullied. So I was called all kinds of names like, weirdo, freak, loner, all of that stuff. So they were sticking these labels on me, and it gave me a whole lot of self-loathing. And so when I started becoming more familiar with alternative culture and that, which was at the time it was a mix of sort of like that later stages of more goth with the earlier years of emo. There's the mid noughties. You would hear these same people being yelled at, being called a weirdo and a freak and all of that. It's like, oh, wait a minute. That's me. Wait, they look cool. I like them. And it's like, okay, there's this natural sense of camaraderie. And I got into, alternative styles, a lot more in high school. And part of that was kind of taking ownership of, okay, you are different. That is bad. And it was me going, yeah, I'm different, but I'm not going to let you make me feel bad about that. I'm actually going to own it, and I'm going to start to learn to be comfortable with it. And I think that sort of, and that was before I got my autism diagnosis, and that kind of got me on the path of learning to sort of accept myself as myself. And I don't think I could have done that if I'd not discovered, alternative culture, and then, later get into, the goth scene and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because by having this exterior that is very deviant to the norm, even in the height of the new goth revival in the 2010s, it was still very deviant and from the norm. And and so I'm totally with Carolyn in that whole stupid, we have arbitrary rules on fashion, this is stupid, I like looking like this, I don't care, I'm just gonna do my thing. And I think that was really good for building up a lot of confidence for myself. And I know many others in the goth scene who are autistic or in other ways neurodivergent or disabled, and I think they would have a sort of similar story where they were excluded, and so they took what was something that was meant to put them down and instead used that and you kind of
Yes.
turn that into something to be more productive and positive.
Mm-hmm.
I think initially I had that sort of sense of, right, if you're going to call me a freak, I will be a freak. And I went through a phase of trying very much to be the opposite of everything that was expected of me, and being sent against my will on a scholarship to the private or girls' Catholic boarding school, where I was made fun of for being the poor kid and the scholarship girl, meant that I decided I was going to be a communist, because that's the opposite of being sort of as that sort of posh capitalism.
That is beautiful.
I was going to be a witch, because that's the opposite of being a Christian, and I wasn't really into being the whole Satan thing was a little too far for me in terms of like being too opposite for its own good.
But being a witch,
although I did write an essay once. And we had to write, I think it was from a moral perspective of a different religion, and I decided I was going to use Levian Satanism as my example for one of my A-level religious studies essays, which they had to pass me on, and I loved seeing my very religious, very stuffy teacher have to give me an A on that.
Oh, that's
beautiful.
Really
didn't want to.
That's the best kind of revenge.
I'm not a Levian Satanist, and I have nothing against Levian Satanism, but or any other form of Satanism. I don't feel like it's fair to use edginess for edginess' sake. I feel like that maybe that was insensitive of me to do as a teenager. But it was sort of there to put a point across. I think a lot of the Temple of Satan, or was it the Church of Satan? That's the secular. It's like deliberately tries to against church and state in America. The separation of church and state, and against the mixing of it. Because I think they'd approve of that essay anyway. But it's I think there's a few other. I think everyone had to be like prissy and very very preppy sort of environment, because it's like literally the equivalent to an American prep school. So I was sort of deliberately going to wear very grungy goth. Like I was going to rip my tights up, and I was going to wear black lipstick that was deliberately smudged, and I was going to pander eye kohl makeup, and I was going to wrap my hair in big sort of spider legs and mess sort of looking hairstyles, all ratted very badly back combed into a big giant bird's nest on my head.
Perfect.
And I was just going to try and look sort of like this very sort of punky, like very so that kind of thing, where I was like defining myself oppositionally. And I did that, I think, for a year or so in my teenage things. And I look back at it and I laugh because I can't cringe. Basically, if I laugh at it, I'm not cringing, because honestly, I find it pretty cringeworthy. But that's what I did for a little bit, and then as I went on, I felt like I didn't see the point in defining myself in opposition, in defining myself by other people. Like, why?
Good, thank you.
Eventually, I came to sort of this thing of like it seemed quite. I mean, I got my kicks for a little bit antagonizing authority because I was a teenager, and that's what teenagers do. They push boundaries, but it didn't really. It wasn't about me being me. It was about me being angry.
Right.
And angry about the way I was being treated.
Yeah. Angry
and rebellious about feeling constrained. And as I got older and I could escape those constraints, well, still obviously I still feel like it was unfair, but it's not. I didn't have that sort of immediate desire to be defiant of it. I felt like I should look inwards. What do I like?
Yes.
And it's interesting that I started off with this very angry, sort of punky, trad goth looking thing. I was a bit of a more goth really in my music tastes, because Marilyn Manson was persona non grata in that kind of environment. You don't mention people like that. He's the Antichrist superstar. Yeah. So of course I had to like Marilyn Manson. He's now persona non grata for other reasons, but that's a different discussion for a different day. But it was very much that, and I think it's a part of growing up is sort of looking at yourself. And I went through these different phases. I went through a steampunk phase, I went through a hippie phase. My dad was a hippie, so I grew up around a lot of sort of like the late 60s, 70s type hippiness, because that's what I was into. So I think that reflected in some of my interests. It still does every now and again. And so I went through that phase. I went through a steampunk phase. And then eventually I just circled back round to goth. And it was like, this is where I was meant to be all along. this is what most reflects my interests. It's always
Yes.
and it sort of got, and it was like that thread that ran through all the different phases of like, I like the gowns with the big bell sleeves. I like being able to dress like I'm a Victorian explorer or an 18th century vampire. I like the fact that one of my steampunk personas was male. I liked being able to experiment outside the constraints of what I was expected of being female.
Right.
I liked that sort of way of, I could play with a lot of things. And so it's not surprising that as time grew on and I sort of got back into being goth, I ended up wearing a lot of pirate shirts and frock coats.
Oh my god, yes, pirate shirts are life.
Trousers and the knee-length boots, and I'm dressing like the Start again. Surprise. So,
and I think there's still a little bit of defiant and delicious gratification when you're just happily dressing how you want to dress and being how you want to be, and still seeing people like, what the heck are you doing? And it's like, why are you bothered by it? You're adorable. Go have your own life. I'm still going to be over here enjoying myself while you're having a problem? I'm sorry you feel that way. Like, I'm sorry that my fashion is the focus of your existence.
Yeah, it's I think Carolyn, actually, you raised some really good points there, because like I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many similarities in terms of like I went through the phases as well. And as well as like, because the environment I was growing up in, as well as like going to school and having been sort of sidelined throughout most of school, I was also in a highly spiritually abusive environment. I was being raised in what was ostensibly a charismatic Pentecostal evangelical style Bible-based cult, is the best way I can describe it. And that was it's as fun as it sounds, which is not at all for anyone who doesn't detect sarcasm.
We're gonna have like 4 other podcasts that we're gonna have to be on, because we've got topics for days.
We're gonna spin off a whole new show, I think. Yeah.
This is beautiful.
It's funny, like while I did start out, I was like, okay, yeah, there's all those freaks, and I'm a freak too, I'm gonna go be with them. Like, I didn't feel like rebelling against my parents. I mean, my parents are very like, by the time I was in high school, my parents were starting to really question a lot of the dodgy stuff that was going on in the place. And my mum did develop a chronic illness, and when I was in high school, which slowed her life down significantly. She did recover from it. She's one of the rare cases where she did, because it was due to we found it was due to her having a proto-diabetic condition of hypoglycemia, and it's managed with a very strict diet and lifestyle. And she was able to sort of recover from that. But so for that reason, like, my parents cared a lot less about what others expected of them, and they were like, because myself and all my family are still very spiritual people, but we're on a complete, like, we're not at all like the kind of people we were back then. And it was so, but it's interesting, at the time my parents could see that this was developing in me, and they could see that this was something that made me happy and that brought me joy. And they were like, and because they were creative people, they were involved in creative events and stuff like that. Like, my mum had once been part of a professional dance troupe when she was a kid. Like, she was especially very artistic. They were cool with it. And they, in fact, bought me some of the first, goth jewelry I ever wore. And they were very supportive of me. Obviously, like, people like Marilyn Manson are out of the question. Again, for different reasons why he's out of the question now. But they were very, because they were very supportive, I wasn't feeling rebellious about it. I was just like, I just like this. I feel happy when I do this. And that was a problem for the group that we were in. But my parents my parents made damn well sure that I wasn't hauled into a meeting, because that used to happen. Regardless of someone's age, if the leaders felt that you're out of line, you'd be hauled into a meeting and they break you down. And my parents made sure that didn't happen to me, so that thankfully didn't happen. I was shielded from some of the worst of it. But yeah, it's interesting that like I did kind of at first was like be oppositional and stuff, but these days it's like it's just why like I don't care if people approve of it or not. If they approve of it, great. If they don't approve of it, great. I don't care. Like, you know,
I love it.
It just doesn't matter. I loved
Yeah.
when chokers and platforms and all that became like the big fashion staple in the 2010s. Like
Mhm.
I saw goths bitching about that, and yeah, okay, so it's unfair that, you know, some celebrity goes, "Oh yeah, total hot goth look." Yeah, okay, that's a bit cringe. But come on, like when are we going to get another chance to have like $20, you know, platform boots?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's like, okay, this really sucks. I don't like how it happened, but I'm going to capitalize on the situation and fill my wardrobe before it's gone.
And I did that. I totally did that. I still got stuff that I bought like in 2013 when I hauled everything in.
Yes.
Well, let me kind of diverge off of that then into the question around positive action that we can take then to change, either in the goth scene specifically or just broader culture, the way that we treat each other, the accessibility options. Like, what steps should us or others take to provide better community support for everyone in general? I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that.
Before we
Yeah.
answer the next question, can I make a little clarification? I want to say that I said that I was using witchcraft oppositionally, and that's something that I actually now find as someone who's first of all, I became Wiccan before I was using it oppositionally. I became interested in Wicca when I was about 12, and then dedicated myself when I was 13. And it wasn't until I was about 14, 15 that I was trying to do this sort of diametrically opposed behaviour. And I feel that I was appropriating witchcraft in a way that was unknowingly supporting a lot of the negative stereotypes people have about the witchcraft community and about witchcraft, in that it is just something done to rebel against Christianity, that we are anti-Christian, which, first of all, there are Christian witches.
Mm-hmm.
I'm friends with some. And secondly, folk magical practice has historically been very syncretic with various forms of Christianity. And that's not just in British culture, that's in a lot of cultures. And thirdly, I actually now, if I met my teenage self doing that, I would give myself a telling off, and quite a severe one, because I think it was reinforcing that notion that we're just angry at Christianity. And I was angry at Christianity at that time, because I was going through some very difficult things with the church I'd been attending, with the people who were running the boarding school, which I don't want to go into on a public broadcast. And I had a lot of emotions. I wasn't dealing with healthily. I didn't have very good coping mechanisms. But that's not what witchcraft is about. And it's not what Wicca and neo-paganism are about. Neo-paganism is not anti-Christian. It's just completely different. It's in an entirely different paradigm. Christianity is not opposed to the Christian God. It is not in worship of the Christian devil. It's got nothing to do with that cosmology entirely. We don't operate in that sort of dualistic cosmology where it's like
as a fellow witch, thank
evil
you.
on one side and good on the other. And I don't want people thinking that, you know, that's just what witchcraft is, or that's what my opinion of witchcraft is. I have been into witchcraft since I was 13. I am now 31. That's a very long time. I am very dedicated to my community. I run my local open circle. I've been involved in teaching governance, and to me, my spirituality is a very important part of my life. And I would never want, as an adult, to disrespect witchcraft in that way again. And yes, it achieved my goal of antagonizing people, but that's not what the religion is for. And I was doing it disservice through that behavior.
Completely agree. Yeah. We should, after we're done, we'll stick around. We'll bootstrap our new Wiccan podcast after this.
Sounds good. I'm down.
Sorry, I should clarify. Yeah, I used the wrong term there. Witchcraft. Yeah. There is a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Different type of witch here. I now work in a more traditional folk-based practice, and I am a Celtic polytheist, and I don't like the some of the more old-fashioned versions of Wicca have a very binary gender divide in its cosmology of the god and the goddess.
Yeah, when it comes to Wicca, I very much consider it almost the Catholicism of the different neo-pagan practices, because there are so many rules and regulations and very strict, like, male and female roles.
That puts it in perspective for me, because I am a practicing Catholic, so that actually does put it into perspective for me.
Yeah, it's very rigid. It's very rules-based. There are certain things that have to be met in order for you to, like, go up in ranks, even. I looked at that when I was first testing the waters of witchcraft, and that was when I was, like, 11 and 12. And don't get me wrong, it was a helpful gateway tool, but it definitely wasn't the appropriate fit for me as I developed as a young woman and looked more into the different traditions.
I think the emphasis on ritualistic practices, like in more hermetic practices and thelema and stuff, was probably a little closer to Catholicism. But yeah, Wicca also has a big focus on deities as well, which isn't really my thing.
Yeah.
I think Wicca is probably close to the High Anglican tradition in flavour, probably because I think some of the people who were involved in Wicca at the beginning came from that sort of background.
That's likely.
And I'd say it's less Catholic and more High Anglican. Having been to both Catholic and High Anglican churches,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
It definitely comes, I think, from that sort of English, very, very quintessentially English as Gardner was. He's pretty much the British Empire. He went out to live in the Far East as part of the Empire and other thing. He's sort of very quintessentially from that more upper class background, and I think that fed a lot into his development of Wicca, as did the background that a lot of people in that circle had from Anglican Christianity rather than Catholic Christianity. And I think there's also the Rosicrucian order fed in as well. There's some stuff, lots of stuff cribbed from Crowley, but of course there's lots of stuff cribbed from Crowley. But I definitely, you can definitely taste the Englishness of it.
Right.
And of a very very much that upper middle class to upper class, early 20th century Englishness of it sort of oozes from the pores of the origins of Wicca. And that sort of the amount of deviance you could get away with if you were of a certain social class that made him being a nudist and him incorporating flagellation and that sort of thing into Wicca kind of expected, considering the social media he was in. So I feel like you can, there's the various different threads of cultural influence that came into Wicca. As someone who lived in southeast England and among sort of the upper middle classes for a while, it's very much like these days you get sort of more artsy people who end up being quite new age. It's just transplant that back in history a few decades, and you kind of see the people who joined the New Forest Coven, the kind of people who are involved. And there are some notable examples of people who came from more working class backgrounds, but it was very much a middle class religion. It was very much taking in people who were dissatisfied with primarily Anglican Christianity, because that was the main religion in England at the time. Very much the threads of cultural appropriation that have been perpetuated through the pagan sort of, I won't say cultural group, and that's come in. Considering that a lot of Gardner's spiritual ideas were taken from his studies of tribal groups, which says a lot, doesn't it? Yeah. Studies of tribal groups. And he was a bit of an amateur anthropologist. And I would imagine he thought himself as being very understanding of these people, but it came with a certain paternalism that was inherent to that sort of social strata. that sort of privilege, and you can see how over time, sometimes it's all going to be ancient Egypt we're going to borrow from, and then all of a sudden we're going to have a phase where it's native North American spirituality we're going to try and borrow from, and these threads of appropriation, how easily they fit into various, and we call them eclectic Wicca, and how it goes back a lot further than that, because although it's dressed up very much as being like a revival of British and European ancient pagan ways, and this creation myth for the religion that we are the survival of this ancient religion from pre-Christian times, which is utter bunk. That even though that's how it's dressed up, a lot of it was borrowing from other cultures and trying to fill in the gaps where we'd lost things with stuff from other cultures, which isn't necessarily like, it's a thing that has happened in anthropology as well, where that sort of is, especially with looking at ancient cultures, where there was definitely a thread of trying to compare them to more primitive cultures in the current world, which was something that was a very Victorian idea. It's like, you're calling these people primitive,
right,
and comparing them to people in prehistoric times, that's not very nice.
No, that made my eye twitch. You couldn't hear it, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's that. Sorry, I'm going on a long. You can delete that entire tangent about the history of Wicca, because
I don't like the, in general, just the appeal to I guess historicity, or the idea that for something to be authentic and meaningful, it has to have some roots in something ancient, or pre-Christian or whatever.
Exactly.
I don't like that in the first place.
It's just an appeal to tradition, which has its own problems.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I like history. I do a lot to incorporate things that are historical, but I'm aware that I'm cribbing from a lot of different parts of history, and it was never a cohesive whole. It's never been a continuous tradition. It's that people have always sought out ways to interact with their local environment and to interact with spirituality and their culture, and that in a certain geographic area, because I'm interested in like the spirituality of place, it goes back through time, but it was never one thread. It was always changing, and what we are doing now is something else. It's our own attempt,
right?
And the only tradition is a much more vague concept of people in this geographic area interacting with the landscape, and interacting with whatever concept of divinity they happen to have at the time, whether that's some paleo-pagan polytheistic concepts, or whether that's some possibly animist concept, or whether that's Christianity and Christian mysticism. I mean, Lindisfarne is famous for being a Christian place. That's still part of the spiritual and mystic traditions of the British Isles. It's got zero to do with any sort of goidelic or Brythonic deities. It doesn't have to have that. It's, monasticism had its own connection to land and landscape. It doesn't make it invalid because it's Christian. And it's if you're looking at how people explore the sense of place and the spirituality of place for a given geographic location, and you look through time, that's one thing. But you can't claim that it's some unbroken lineage, an unbroken tradition, when it's about as shattered into a million pieces as it could possibly get, especially when a lot of these things are idiosyncratic to the individual. So tradition is sort of irrelevant. I mean, William Blake is, for example, a British Christian mystic, about as mystic as you're going to get.
Oh, yeah.
But he didn't really fit into any, traditional pattern. It doesn't fit into traditional Christian mysticism. He certainly wasn't a pagan. He kind of fits in with the Romantic era and Romantic conceptualizations, but again, he was just him. And when you're sort of incorporating people like that into your study of historical things for a place, it's tradition isn't the word for it. And I think people who want a tradition, who want a lineage, I don't know, maybe they're envisioning ancient Buddhist temples that have stood on a mountain for whatever hundreds of years or something, or some great Christian monastery that's had monks there for the past millennia. They're not, it's not what neo-paganism is. You're not going to get that from neo-paganism. And if you want to start that, then I hope that the people in 1,000 years from now can go look back on you and say you've succeeded. But We haven't built that yet. And I don't personally want to.
I actually have a. I think we could really talk about this for a long time, but for the sake of us having meals later, I'm gonna redirect us into something else.
Sorry,
no,
I
it's
waffle.
fine because I was about.
If I'm hyperverbal and I waffle, shut me up when I need to.
I was about to respond and share a bunch of thoughts about that, and then I was like, wait, no, we'll never leave. We have to. So let me see where I can redirect. Let's jump to this was something that Trey brought up to me when we were talking about this episode that I think was something we didn't touch on previously, and it's the explanation of and talking about the differences between visible and invisible disability and the ways that those are treated differently by people that aren't really familiar with that.
Autism makes you behave differently, which is visible and noticeable to others. If they don't know you're autistic, or if you're not quote unquote autistic enough to be very visibly autistic as something they can conceptualize as autism, which a lot of people on the spectrum aren't, then that's it. You're visibly different. You're visibly a little bit off.
Mm-hmm.
But you're in an uncanny valley where you're close enough to normal, but they don't know how to categorize you.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it a very odd space to be in socially, where people are like, why is this person acting differently? Why are they socially incoherent? Or why are they doing this behavior that's unusual? Why do they talk too much? Why do they do this? Why do they do that? And it's very difficult for them to comprehend that it is actually a disability because, like, oh, you're erudite. Oh, you're socially, apparently, mostly fluent. How do you not? How are you still autistic? Like, they don't get that.
In terms of the wider community, I mean, obviously, it's a lot of it is to do with accessibility of places, and I think this would affect the goth scene as well in terms of physicality, in terms of creating accessible spaces, be it through universal design, so ramps for people who have mobility issues, working lifts or elevators as well, and accessible parking, that sort of thing, and that sort of thing is mostly brought in through legislation. I think having a like it's kind of a societal structure issue, and that gets into a whole political sphere, which is a whole other discussion. But I think it's very much I think COVID's kind of showing how we can somewhat restructure a society around prioritizing people over economy, and how important that is, because if you run things by purely utilitarian lens, you start getting into some real ethical quibbles on people's quote unquote usefulness to a society. And I think COVID has kind of exposed how we were starting to head into a direction that's like very detrimental to the ethics of people's well-being for that reason.
In England, we've headed that direction for a very long time now.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's been...
Yeah.
I've literally been having depressive breakdowns the past couple months because of that.
Yeah, and I think it's like in terms of both, and this is both people with visible and invisible disabilities. I think this whole COVID thing has really exposed this major flaw that runs throughout probably like pretty much the Western neoliberal societies that we're in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, all of that. And I think it's I think it will be interesting to see what comes out of this as a result. I hope that governments will learn. I doubt they will, but I'm hoping at least the community will learn from this. Now, in terms of like attitudes of bigotry as well, I think that would be interesting to see, because unfortunately, people with disabilities, I'm going to say something a little controversial here, but I feel like bigotry against people with disabilities is a problem that I found that it seems very socially acceptable even amongst more progressive circles to have views of disabled people that are borderline eugenics based, and that is scary to me, because it's this very paternalistic idea of, especially when you're dealing with people with developmental disabilities such as autism and Down syndrome, and that of, well, they can't decide these things for themselves, so they have to have someone decide for them. And that is something that absolutely has to be fought against, because you find that people with disabilities are far more likely to be victims of abuse by caregivers than those without disabilities. And when you have awful situations where they are abused and, God forbid, even killed by their own caregivers, the narrative always is, well, it's understandable why the caregiver would do that, because having to take care of someone like that was such a burden. That is an attitude that I found even in progressive and leftist circles that absolutely needs to be gotten rid of, because
that is horrifying.
It is, and it's very real, and it's and again, my sibling who is a child, one of those things where if a news story happens of an autistic child being murdered by their parents, we always have to make sure we have to shield them from that, because we know that kids internalize such messages, and that is a very, very problematic thing, because you are dealing with their self-worth, you are dealing with their safety, and you are dealing with a group of people who everyone else is talking about, oh, this is what they need, but they don't actually have their interests at heart. It is something that I've found across the board. It's and I've kind of said, like, it's one of the last acceptable bigotries is bigotry against disabled people, because of the fact that it's still so pervasive, this level of bigotry in progressive and leftist circles, where in progressive and leftist circles, any other bigotry is completely unacceptable. Like, you, and rightly so, be, called out on acts or words of bigotry on the basis of race, gender, sexuality. With disability, it's that there's a squabble, but that's it. It's almost tacitly accepted. That absolutely is just complete, like, has to go.
I think another thing that is going on with this sort of like, oh, but the poor caregiver was so stressed.
Yeah,
it's inevitable. It's being used to push under the rug the complete lack of support on a systemic level for the caregivers and for the autistic people. Like, it's like, it's not inevitable if we had a society where there was decent, healthcare support for autistic people, for the respite care for the carers of people who are more severely autistic. If there was, it's like, it's just like, oh, it's inevitable. No, it's systemic inequality. It's not inevitable. The system
maybe if those
needs to change.
caregivers weren't having to work 14 hours a day constantly with too many people that they have to handle because people can't get into the schooling that's needed in order to do these jobs, or these jobs weren't looked down upon, or there were actually, again, support for people who are doing these jobs, mental health care. Like, if there were enough people able to help instead of it being looked down upon, yeah, we might be okay. And if those people were paid a living wage, so that they weren't having to work 14 hours a day to make sure that they can just make ends meet.
Something I saw, an article was saying that a lot of people who are in America who work in care come from non-white backgrounds and come from socially, economically deprived backgrounds. And it's like, oh, so, these are people who systematically have a harder time in America anyway, are being put into stressful jobs where they're underpaid, underappreciated, and made to work long hours. It's like, here goes the normal systematic inequality. Like, it's, caring as a profession is, it's women's work, and it's harking back to the notions of servants and people who were classed as the type for being a servant. Like, it's hideously racist that this is like conceptualizes who ought to be doing those jobs.
I think there's been a shift in my country over some of this narrative, which has been there were two very shocking deaths within weeks of each other, and both of them were pretty much open shut cases of murder, and they were horrific. They both involved long bouts of neglect and deliberate starvation. One was a woman with cerebral palsy who was nonverbal and had to depend on carers. She had been very well cared for by her family. They provided for her. She lived in a wealthy part of the city that she was living in, so she was of a well-to-do background. And the caregiver that was supposed to be working for her on her insurance plan. We have an insurance scheme in Australia where it's publicly funded, and it's flexible funding for services, and that it's a bureaucratic nightmare to get into, but once you're in, you're pretty good. And she through this insurance scheme, so had this very well paid for carer, and this carer deliberately ignored her, like put her into a chair that she couldn't move out of, so she was in her own filth. She died of starvation. She was and she had been robbing this woman for years and years of robbing her possessions, transferring funds into the carer's name. It took the caring company didn't fire her initially until public pressure was on them, and it's only recently that she's been arrested, and so far they can only do manslaughter because I think they're still trying to gather evidence. And then a few weeks after, I think it was a few weeks after that, a 4-year-old girl with Down syndrome was found starved to death in her house because it was basically ostensibly by her father, her stepmother, and stepsister, who were all adults. It was just, there were these horrifying cases that have happened earlier this year that have pretty much shaken the country to the core. And I think it's interesting to see someone who's very involved in the disability community to see the reactions that have come out, that the previous things of taking care of someone with disability is really hard, and so it's inevitable this happen. It's like, no, this is unfettered cruelty. This is wrong. There is something very systemically wrong here that this was allowed to happen.
I think a very important distinction needs to be made between people getting insufficient care because of understaffing, or of people being very tired when they're working and not being able to give proper care, where it's not deliberate, where it's simply the system is overstretched and people aren't getting the help they need, and then deliberate acts of cruelty, and there is never an excuse for that.
Yeah.
Like that's just human malice.
No.
And what point I was making earlier was that when you are dealing with systems where, say, someone's medication gets messed up, or that sort of thing happens, or there just simply isn't enough space in a care home for someone to be in the supported kind of care they need, or there isn't they can't get, or someone can't get proper home care, or that kind of a situation where there's unfortunately someone dies. That's where systematic inequality comes in. That's where people who are already very stressed, being for all sorts of other reasons, then being put into a high stress job where they're not being paid well enough, where they're not being given enough breaks and given enough time. That comes into that sort of problem. What you're talking about, where it's deliberate murder, that's just straight up abuse. And there is never an excuse for that. You can't say, it's just like the result system.
No, that is systemic human apathy.
And I think that has been, again, the big wake up call in Australia in terms of how we take care of people, of disabled people and other vulnerable people, because of course with COVID, a lot of aged care homes as well has this whole lid has been blown basically on all these systemic issues, where you have, on the one hand, you have all these systemic issues going on in which disabled and aged people, so basically the most vulnerable people in our population, we're talking like combined, 40 to 50% of our population, being put through the mercy of a system that seems to be failing, and those failures being shown through the acts of cruelty by people who are able to get away with stuff until it is too late, because of these systemic failures. And I think I think this question it's so big because it is a systemic issue.
One of the issues with the systemic failure is the lack of oversight.
Yeah.
And where things aren't being funded enough for there to be enough social workers, or enough for social workers to have the correct caseload to be checking in on people.
Yeah.
This happens when you get babies who are starved to death or abused. It happens when whenever you have someone who is physically very vulnerable, and someone ought to be checking on them, and they just don't.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you have an underfunded social care system. People aren't checking. Because you can't rely on the goodness of people's hearts. You can't just assume people are going, because they're family, they're going to be good, kind, and caring. You get awful people, and they're awful to their families. I know.
Yeah.
My mother was awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, my father was awful. Like, it happens.
Yeah.
It can't be ignored.
Yeah. I think in the goth scene, like, although this can apply to the goth scene, like in terms of, watching one's own prejudicial attitudes towards people with disabilities, maybe, not falling into, because I understand there can be quite an overlap between, the goth community and sort of the more progressive and, sort of, because, most goths are fairly liberal, liberal to progressive. I wouldn't say there's very many on the right or even the left, but definitely liberal and progressive. And, it's, so I think it's, like minding that. I think as well, like kind of just this looking out for each other as well. And definitely be aware of, again, being aware of any kind of bigotry and that within. Unfortunately, we have had in our local scene incidents of outright bigotry against, people like, people of different races, of different gender identities. We've had to deal with some of that in our local scene. Those people get very, publicly called out, and and people will, take what they will from that. But then when it comes to attitudes around disability, it's interesting to see like how they can kind of fall into some of those same mind traps. They don't often realize they're doing it, but they do. And it's I think unfortunately when we've had incidences in the goth community, this is a kind of uncomfortable thing to talk about, but I think it is necessary. Unfortunately, the goth community is seen as a very safe space for vulnerable people, because these are, we're all people who have had experiences, say, with trauma, with being sidelined and all of that, even before we, started dressing all in black. We were all already kind of the weird kids. And so, a lot of people take that baggage with them into the goth scene. Unfortunately, predators see that. And I think that's the unfortunate thing, where in the goth scene we do in a lot of the different scenes. I think you'll talk to anyone who's had either experienced or witnessed some of it, where unfortunately we do get some abusive people in the scene. Unfortunately, quite a few of them are men. And when we have experiences with abusive men in the goth community, it's a lot of the women they seem to target are women who have some form of mental illness, some form of chronic illness, or some form of disability. And that is and that becomes a problem, because unfortunately abusers will often use those sorts of things to undermine a person's credibility when they try to speak out about it. we all hear the line from people of, oh, she's crazy or he's crazy or they're crazy.
Right, yeah.
If someone speaks up and is like, this happened to me. And I've experienced this, I've witnessed this, and it's when you have people kind of tacitly accepting that, it's like that. See, that is a prejudicial attitude that would need to be dealt with in the goth scene, of like, oh, just dismissing someone who has a history of mental illness or disability as being quote unquote crazy when they try and speak up about something. It's like, maybe not do that. Maybe actually hear out that person before you are quick to take the side of someone who is so quick to point out, oh, that person is crazy. Like, hear out both sides. Give the same weight of credibility to a person who is obviously, deviated their mental health or their physical health or their disability, as you would to the person who is being, urging you to dismiss that.
Yes.
I think there's a very complex relationship between mental illness and the goth community. It's interesting how there's also quite a bit of romanticization of mental illness in the goth community, but simultaneously prejudice towards it. The amount of things that are like straight jackets as a fashion statement, or like pills as a fashion statement, and that kind of thing, where for some people it can be an exploration and an expression of their own journey with mental illness or with other disabilities. But there are also a lot of people who think it's edgy, or it makes them like this tortured soul artist archetype. And I find that's very prevalent in the goth community and very toxic. And I think it inclines people to disbelieve when someone says, "Oh, I have a mental illness." They're like, there's that undercurrent of, do they really have a mental illness? Or are they just saying that for edginess points? And that seed of doubt. And it's, I think if you're outright faking a mental illness, that itself is probably like Munchausen's and is its own disorder, right? Like, there is a point where it becomes a mental disorder of that sort of thing. That's its own issue. But I think there's also certain people who just throw it in there. Like, it's not the same. It's not Munchausen's. It's it's just a throwaway comment. Oh, I have depression or something. Try and make especially younger people who may not like fully understand what terms they're using. It could be accidental, but I think there is this romanticization and a lot of like the asylum imagery and the crazy girl imagery and like the ooh, she's cute but psycho, which is fed into pop culture a lot. Like that romanticization of the Joker in Harley Quinn and the romanticization of mental illness in that, it's it's very pervasive in a sort of pop culture alternative milieu, and I find that it's got problematic elements. I'm not saying it's a problem to express mental illness in the goth community, or that anyone expressing something relating to mental illness is romanticizing it, and I think there is definitely an important aspect of reclaiming your experiences for yourself as not necessarily something positive, because some things just they're not positive, but sometimes there's ways of like this has been an experience that has formed who you are, and I think of reclaiming identity, like from being dismissed as crazy to being like, no, this is my mental illness is part of who I am. That I think is healthy and positive, but people who then appropriate that because they think, ooh, this makes me darker and edgier. That's not good. And I think there's a lot of that in the subculture. And I think it's something that the subculture needs to address.
It's still a form of othering, right? It's taking something and co-opting it for your own use because of some side benefit you believe it has. And it's very similar to what all of you were expressing earlier when you're talking about, the mental health or just general disabilities being a part of who you are. It's not a hat that someone can put on. It's not a badge of honor. It's just a thing. It's just it's something that exists. It's part of who you are. It made who you are. But it can't be something that other people aspire to, because that's not who they are. They need to embrace who they are, the quirks and special things that make them unique, and not aspire to have this edgy thing, because it's not just something you pick off a shelf. It is part of an identity. It's part of who you are as an individual.
And even when people are well-meaning, and I don't like to be dismissive of when people mean well, but I think that also can have a detrimental thing if they kind of like go in with their own mind of things rather than kind of getting to understand what it is from that other person's perspective, not gain some understanding from that, because like, yeah, if you're just like, oh yeah, cute, oh it's a cute but psycho sort of thing, it's like, oh great, like you're not actually seeing me as a person, you're seeing me as, a character. And this is real life. I know we like to indulge a little in fantasy and romanticism in the goth scene, and about, being weird and spooky, but it's like we can't lose our touch with reality. I know that for myself, like being autistic as well, especially because I'm more like bubbly, chatty, like autistic, and just has this like very like I'm kind of your quintessential perky goth, basically. I remember this thing that really wreaked havoc in my dating life, particularly, was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, when there was this obsession with the manic pixie dream girl in romantic comedies. And the impact that seemed to have on a lot of, particularly like a lot of geeky guys, because I tended to be more like the nerdy type guys that I would be dating. They were the ones I got on with the best. And look, there's a dearth of men in single, men who are into women in my local goth scene. So like most of the guys I dated ended up being nerds. But they kind of internalized this message of she's the quirky girl that's gonna make my life so amazing. It's like, I'm a fully self-actualized human being. Like my disability isn't this cute quirky thing. It's like there are upsides and there are downsides, and if you aren't willing to take on the downsides, then what are you even doing here? And
yeah,
I think that that is a problem as well, because they're like in the goth scene and tangential alternative scenes, when guys are dating, particularly women who have autism and ADHD, they're like, oh my gosh, she's like, they're not consciously thinking it, but they're basically like, oh my gosh, she's this cute quirky girl who helps me come alive. And it's like, no, that's not how disability works. It's not always this cute quirky thing. It's just a thing. And if you are only here for, I mean, this applies to anyone, but like, if you're only here for the good times, but you can't handle the times where something happens completely out of our control, that is less than positive, again, what are you even doing here? And I think that can apply to friendships as well in the scene, and that sort of thing. So this is very basic kind of level, but that's also important too.
I think it's, especially when you are an autistic person who's very have quite high energy social stuff, and I'm hyperverbal, so I have a high energy social stuff. There's this expectation that's like the only way autism manifests is that I'm just special interests and being chatty and never knowing when to shut up, and I'm just that quirky odd girl, and then it comes with meltdowns because things are too sensitive. Then people don't realize that they are pushing you into a meltdown because they are like, they're like, you're a high energy social person, you can cope with this. No, I can't. And you try and back out, be like, no, I can't deal with it. I have a friend in the goth scene, ex-friend in the goth scene for many reasons, including her giving me food poisoning.
Ew.
And accidentally, she didn't poison me. She just left the food out in a hot car for a day, and it got
oh dear gods.
Yeah, and then I got rather ill. Yeah, we were at a castle, and she just left it in the car all day, and it went. And I was like, I wanted to leave early. She has a lot of. Basically, the main issue I had was that she'd insist that we'd go to a bar or something. I'm like, it's too loud. It's giving me a headache. I can't concentrate on the conversation. I can't hear our conversation because I can't differentiate all these sounds.
Yeah.
This is, stressing me out. And then I need to go. And she'd be very annoyed with me because I duck out early. And I said every single time, I can't cope with these busy bars. So she took me did it about 4 times in a row. But I just said, that's it. I'm not going to hang out with you anymore because you keep putting me in situations I can't cope with. And when I try and get out of it, you get annoyed with me.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's like,
There's
I'm high energy and I'm chatty, but I can't cope with this much volume. And stop taking me to especially when you take me to normie bars where I also feel like I'm being gawked at.
God.
And it's like, she's obviously quite okay with that because she's also very visibly goth. But I'm fine with, if it's just staring or the odd comment, I can sort of just water off a duck's back. But I don't like being around people who've had alcohol who are doing that because I've had very negative, violent experiences with people who have been drunk and taken objection to me being goth. So the last place I want to be stared at or get weird comments is in an environment where people are drinking.
Yeah.
And she couldn't seem to understand
exactly.
that. It's like, she probably hasn't had quite the same experience as I have, and, fair enough. But
lucky her.
I'm saying I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here repeatedly. And I've had this with, she's one example. I don't want to do this. And I'm not going to keep doing it. And unfortunately, if people keep trying to push me into that, they are not my friend. Because they're not being friendly, and they're not caring how I can deal with the situation. That's not being a friend.
Yeah.
And
no, that's the lack of basic human decency.
Or whatever. But I'm just not up for being pushed in situations that are stressing me out emotionally because I have my own. It's not quite agoraphobia, although I think it's starting to head that way after not seeing people for several months and now having to go to town and decide.
Right.
But that's another discussion upon me. But it's like sensory overload combined with what is effectively a bit of a PTSD trigger for me is not a good combination. And if you are ignoring that, you're not being a good friend. And it's the thing, you're quirky and high energy, you can deal with it. No. That's it. There is no, beyond that. No.
You should be able to just say, no, I do not want to do this, and have it not
I think that's
be a
where,
thing.
I've been very fortunate in that a lot of the friends that I've made in the goth scene were very sensitive to that. I think it helps that that a good portion of them, including my best friend in the scene, are in some way neurodivergent. My best friend in the scene's a DJ, and he obviously not now because there's nothing on, but he's also got Asperger's, and he has, so he and I are able to kind of get that, oh hey, this is a bit too much. He's I think he's a little less sensitive to some stuff than I am. I'm a lot more hypersensitive in some environments, but it's having that level of camaraderie. And then there's a about 3 or 4 other people in the scene I know who are in some way autistic or neurodivergent. We get it. They get it. We get it. Oh hey, this is getting a bit too much. Oh hey, well do you want to go somewhere quieter? Okay, cool. It was so I've been very fortunate with that, but I know other people who haven't been so fortunate to have friends in and out of the goth scene who are that understanding. And I think that's the core of it, is that basic sense of respect. And what does that look like for each of your friends? What are your friends' boundaries, and how do you respect them? I've had to break off friendships because of them not respecting my boundaries, including people on the spectrum who just did not respect my boundaries, and and would put a lot of demands on me in a friendship that I cannot do. Not that I am not willing to do, but that it was just impossible for me to do. And so for that reason, like, I've had to break off friendships because I'm like, I'm sorry, you were demanding of, I've told you I can't do this. And then when I tell you I can't do this, you try and guilt trip me into feeling like I'm being a bad friend because, oh, well, you're on the spectrum. It's hard for you to make friends. You shouldn't, you shouldn't just chuck a friendship away. And it's like, I'm not chucking a friendship away, if you are disrespecting my boundaries. And I think that is also very important. Again, that's a very paternalistic, we know what's best for you kind of attitude to have for someone with a disability. A person with a disability does not have to be friends with everyone. They don't have to be liked by everyone. And they don't have to meet everyone's demands when it's impossible for them to. Because a person who doesn't have a disability, if they can't cope with that level of demand, why would someone who has disability that affects those very things, why would they be able to cope? They wouldn't. Like, that's part of what having a disability entails.
Helen, did you want to share anything on that?
I'm going to start with like steps that the community should be taking because I want to address it on a more personal level. Because what I heard echoed both in Carolyn's and Amy's talks was a basic lack of human decency and apathy. And it should not be hard to simply care about a person and give them respect. And if we can all do that on a personal level, then it will make the kind of ripples that need to happen in society in order to make a better, more comfortable space for people with neurodivergencies, for people with disabilities. And really that all starts with just being able to look past the end of your own freaking nose. Like, if you can think about somebody other than yourself for 2 seconds, that will be so immensely helpful. And if you're already doing that, thank you for being the right kind of person and for making this world better just by being able to think of someone else. And if not, check yourself, please. Because, like, it's visible with COVID happening. People aren't caring about other people. And that's not a new problem. It's just something that COVID is highlighting. This is how people have been thinking the whole time.
For the first month, everyone... Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead, darling.
Everyone was sort of helping each other out. People were bringing groceries to their elderly neighbours and leaving them on the doorstep and checking each other was okay and making sure people hadn't run out of supplies. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, it started dwindling. And after about a month, people were just like, eh.
It's like people were tired.
Compassion.
Yes, exactly.
Like, how do you get tired of being compassionate? How does that work?
Yeah,
That's a basic part of being a human being.
It should just be inherent.
I struggle to think sometimes about how people would understand something because I don't have a very good theory of mind sometimes. But at least I understand that if something bad is happening, if I can try and help without being obnoxious, trying to help might be a good idea. And if they say no, they say no. But, offering.
Exactly. And compassion should be reflexive. It should not be something you have to think about.
Yeah.
And it should not be something that feels like an inconvenience. That denotes a personal flaw within that person that needs to be addressed and they need to go figure themselves out.
I'm guilty of obliviousness sometimes, but
right, and that's different. That's not the same thing, really. Because it's different to be oblivious, and it's different to actively know that you're choosing not to care. Which people don't like to think about that in themselves anyway. So, that's willful ignorance.
It was shocking, actually, in the first few weeks here in Australia, where people were literally beating each other up in the shopping aisles for toilet paper.
Right?
That just was like, wow, COVID is exposing everyone right now. Like,
oh yeah,
for who they really are, and it's definitely kind of bleak.
And insanity, like,
like show the worst of humanity.
Like, there's this concept that I think people thought the world is ending. like in a very literal
everybody
sort of sense.
suddenly reacted like it's a zombie movie, and it's like, guys, that was not an example of how to behave. That was an example of look how bad our fantasies can get. That's
It's
not how
like,
you behave.
It's someone taking a warning and treating it as an example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, guys, it's not, I don't know how to tell people to freaking care about each other, but it should not be hard. And the fact that it is denotes an overall societal sickness.
I was in my local supermarket, and the cashier was nearly in tears because she'd been screamed at and threatened by a middle-aged man because she'd told him that the store was operating I think it was like 2 of any item policy, and you weren't allowed to have more than 2 of any one thing. And threatening a cashier
to make sure people weren't hoarding.
Yeah, and like they stripped the toilet roll was gone. Like there was no toilet roll shortage. There was no reason to hoard toilet roll. It's not like COVID-19 gives everyone diarrhea.
If it did, though, that would be hilarious. Not to say that I would actually be hilarious, but that would be the one reason to be hoarding toilet paper. But no, everybody had this knee-jerk reaction, and it's like, guys, really? Are you okay? Did you not? Were you running on no toilet paper at home now, and suddenly it's a luxury item you need to hoard? Like, oh goodness.
And it's interesting to see the flow-on effect that it had, on other people again, because as you were saying, Helen, they weren't looking past their nose, really. They were like, there was
if it didn't affect them, they didn't care.
Yeah, because then suddenly you're finding all these families are unable to get any toilet paper or food, types of food. Sorry to tangent a bit, but I thought the funniest thing was in the beginning of the panic buying, all the rice and the beans and the cans of tomatoes were gone, but all the spices were still fully racked up, and I'm like, oh my god! Like it's
my goodness.
I'm white. Okay, I'm white, and yet I find my own people's like aversion to seasoning puzzling, because I'm like, guys,
I know, right? Me too.
If you buy the spices,
I want to know where this concept that white people don't like herbs and spices came from, because a lot of European food is full of herbs and spices.
Like I may not be using paprika or chili or stuff like that, but you bet my pantry is loaded with parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, oregano. Like those are my northern spices, and that's okay. Again, it's not chili, it's not paprika. It's like, come on now.
I'm half Porto and I'm half Portuguese. Sorry, Australian colloquialism. I'm half Portuguese, and they love their chilies and paprikas and that. And then I'm like, yes, well, that's the half not Portuguese that dominates my palate, because my tongue is way too sensitive to spice. But that said, it's
too.
I still season my food with something more than salt, pepper, and parsley. Like, holy crap! Like it was. It's ridiculous.
Not difficult.
But I digress. But no, it was very it was very telling that it was all of the staples were gone.
Yeah.
So people who are on low incomes, which would include people with disabilities, because people with disabilities are people who are often in low income situations, they were not able to access the basics for a month or two.
Especially when people that are on like welfare and stuff, the basics are what they're allowed to get with their money. Like, so all of the things that they are traditionally allowed to get on these low-income programs are gone.
America that actually says what they're allowed to spend their benefits on.
Food stamps. Food
stamps is very particular about what you're allowed to spend it on, and then there's also a program called WIC, and there are some foods that are WIC approved, and there are foods that are not.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
They're trying to introduce a similar system here in Australia, and a lot of people are not happy about that. But and it's and again, it's this idea that, because you are a certain category of person, be it economic or, disability, the the government or we the people who have all the power, we get to determine how you live.
What you're allowed to
And
spend your money on, what you're allowed to buy to eat.
Yeah. Which is
that's dystopian.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
it's
not
great.
saying universal credit is in any way good, and our system in the UK for various benefits, so I'm on personal independence payments, and there are sort of other types of benefits that you can get in the UK for various things. They do actually, thankfully, allow us to choose what we spend our money on. Like, there's not some rule saying that I'm not allowed to have, I don't know, what did I have to, my olive bread or something, because it's too luxurious. I got it in the review section.
Yeah.
But it's just, they don't let you, like, they don't treat people like adults who can make responsible spending decisions as adults.
Yeah.
Of course, if you can't hold down a job because you're either disabled or because whatever, then obviously you can't choose what kind of food you're allowed to eat.
That
is
so
and
wrong.
It's,
I knew there was the welfare system in the US was broken, but I didn't realise it was quite that broken. Sorry, like blowing my poor little UK brain.
Your mind is allowed to be blown by this because it's absolutely not a fucking K.
No,
it's just
and
not.
It's very like something North Korea would do,
right? I wouldn't quite go that far, but no, it's definitely a dystopian thing where it's like, okay, we're the land of freedom. Like, sorry, America, but like, we're the land of freedom. It's like, you tell people what they can spend their money on. That's not freedom. Like, and I think it's very telling that, unfortunately, the way, and again, this very much relates to disability, with the way the healthcare system works and all of that, where anytime you hear of a Western country outside of the US is going, we're going to reform, say, our health system or our welfare system by cutting funding, literally everyone's reaction is, oh God, we don't want to be like America. It's like, sorry guys, we love you, but your country is like all kinds of broken. And it's like,
the main
we're aware.
It's destroying the NHS.
We fucking know.
We don't want to be America, which is, it's harsh on America, but
we don't want to be America either. We really don't. The people who get to make the decisions are the people who want us to be America, and we don't like them. Like, we don't want to be America either.
I've generally come to the conclusion that the American people aren't the people in charge of America.
Oh, we're not.
No.
And we know. No. We're still going to vote because we have to try, but we're not.
Yeah.
To be fair, the UK isn't in charge. Like, the UK people aren't 100% in charge of the UK, really, either.
No.
Yeah.
Let's just say
it's
Scotland
just England
did not vote for Boris Johnson. And the independence... We've recently learnt that the independence referendum was interfered with by the Russians. Doesn't that sound like a certain scandal that happened in America?
Oh, that sounds like something that's happening in a really big northern continent to your left.
We're 2 steps behind. I feel like in the Tory government, like, Boris Johnson is friends with Trump. And that says everything.
Yeah, no, that's all that needs to say. That is absolutely horrifying. Oh goodness. Yeah. But back to
it's we're going to talk about disability, and it's like, systemic issues are exposed. I mean, that's just how disability conversations go anyway. Like, it's
how disability conversations go. It's especially with COVID.
Inherently now a political issue because of the way everything is just so broken, where the people who are going to suffer a great deal from it. The more physically dependent you are on the state, the more the state being a complete mess is going to ruin your life.
Exactly. And it's not to say, with this statement that I'm about to make, I don't want to say that disabled people are inherently weak, or that people who have mental differences or physical differences are inherently weaker. But it really echoes how broken a system is when we can look at how well they treat the weakest among them. The weakest as in the people that can't function the way the system wants them to function. The way that we treat those people who... Yes, exactly. Thank you. I needed that. The most vulnerable people among us. When we treat them like garbage, we're not far off from treating everybody else like that.
Yeah.
Or it's already happening in different ways. Like of course, slavery is a hot topic here. I think one of the worst forms of slavery that the US in particular has is you can't have healthcare or food or the ability to live in a safe place unless you work more than 40 hours a week. You have to figure out how you're going to afford it on your own because no job will hire you full time because they don't want to be able to pay you the benefits. Like, we are currently slaves to capitalism. Because we must make the mighty clock turn. We must be a cog or else we deserve to die, essentially. That's what it's come down to.
Yeah,
and
I
it's
think wage slavery
absolutely
is
horrid.
the term for that.
I think
Thank
we're getting
you.
very communist. Shh, don't
right? Don't tell them. They don't want to hear that.
I'm sorry. I can't go full tanky. I might go anarcho-syndicalist, but again, dependence on the state. I feel iffy about that even in communist regimes, because let's just say
historically they have
Union
a tendency to end up being a disaster at anything where you have any
humans touch
power,
just kind of falls apart.
Basically, whenever you have someone with an ego in charge, it turns into totalitarianism. Regardless of whatever ideology they espouse as their cover.
Exactly.
Hitler claimed to be a socialist. He was a blatant fascist. They called it was a lie. It was, a populist lie, and that's what and
that's the danger
the epitome
of that.
of the far right. And Stalin wasn't much better. If anything, he was probably worse in terms of deaths.
Yeah, and in terms of and again, we're looking at the history of how people with disabilities were treated. Man, it didn't matter if your government was American or communist or fascist, but you were institutionalized. It was just a matter of fact. Regardless of what country, what ideology your country had, you were an unperson for many, many years until about the middle 20th century. You were a non-person when you were a person with a disability, particularly if it was a more severe form of disability, where you were locked away in an institution. And I think, so while, I 100%, am not a fan of modern neoliberal capitalism in any sense of the form. At the same time, I am a little bit cynical when I do hear people say this ideology will be the best of people with disabilities, or that ideology will be the best of people with disabilities, because one, it's speaking on our behalf when rather than letting us speak for
best
ourselves.
Ideology for people with disabilities.
I was about to say that. Compassion and literally just
it's the best
being
principles.
able to care about the person next to you and having value in human life.
Exactly. Anything outside of that, I'm a bit cynical of, because I'm like, every other political type ideology still put us away and segregated us and neglected us and killed us.
I think all the time it's a top-down ideology that will happen. And I think Karl Marx actually never gave a full true picture of what he thought future communism would be. So we've had so many different things that have called themselves communism. We've had so many different things that call themselves flavors of socialism. And I think I was joking with I was sounding communist, but I'm not a communist. But it does. I think when we think about, we can see the system is broken. And I think you've been able to see that the current system is broken for a very long time. I think what we've got to do is come up with a new way of realizing how society could function. And I personally think that things need to be a lot more grassroots, a lot more localized.
Yes.
I think there needs to be a lot more emphasis on community.
Yes.
I mean, that's coming from someone who doesn't like people, and I think there should be an emphasis on community.
Well, because the individualism that has been running so rampant in the different countries that we are in, this idea that you have to do things on your own, you have to be able to make it on your own, you need to be able to take care of yourself has also bred that not caring for other people. Because we're too busy trying to figure out how to function ourselves. And it's not too busy to exude compassion. Nothing should ever make you too busy for that. It still has made it so that we don't see compassion for the other people.
I think a lot
we
of
think
it
that
is
they
just
should be working.
Everybody is very exhausted. If everyone's working, if people are having to forced to work a 40-hour week, or if people are forced to do 12-hour shifts, they come back knackered. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's not that they care a lot about things. They're just tired. And I think, I don't know, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's deliberate, but it certainly works in favour of, keeping the system as it is if everyone's too tired to change it.
Especially since a lot of the times the people who are the most tired happen to be the most hardworking and compassionate among us. So now they're too tired to do anything about what's going on. We're literally being held hostage.
Compassionate and caring individuals I know. He works 12 and a bit hour shifts as a nurse. He comes home completely tired. The hospital, he loves his job. He loves helping people. I don't think anyone loves doing 12 and a bit hour shifts.
No.
I think
and as a medical worker, I consider that unsafe. He shouldn't have to.
It is.
It's standard.
Exactly. Which is
that's
terrifying.
In the UK now. When I first met him, he was working in a different hospital. His shifts were 6 hours. Which, he came back and he was able to, be a normal awake person.
Actually be a person for the rest of the day? Holy shit.
It's I don't want to talk too much about my partner's business, people's privacy and everything. It just seems unfair that anyone should have to work a 12-hour shift, regardless of what their job is. Even if your job is puppy cuddling, you shouldn't have to do 12 hours of it.
I couldn't do that. I love animals way more than I love humans, and I could not do that.
It's interesting, as well. There's a lot of, because there's confusion around individualism versus individuality as well, and I think even some of the goth scene kind of fall for this, where it's where some of them because there's a contingent of more libertarian type goths, and I love them and respect them, but they're wrong. No, but anyway, I kid. There is. I kid slightly. No, but it's I hear them saying but you can't be your own person. That it's I don't believe in top-down ideologies where an individual person is stifled. They cannot be a fully self-realized individual in terms of who they are in their values and what they choose, what they want to choose to do with their life. But that's individuality. That's not individualism. Individualism, if anything, is detrimental to individuality because if you're expected if you have no choice but to do things all on your own, then all you are going to think of is your survival. It's like the pendulum. If the pendulum swings too far one way, where it's your life is controlled, you have no autonomy. That is completely wrong. That is not community. That's that has been autocratic. But then if it swings too far the other way, where it's you're expected to do everything on your own, you have little to no support whatsoever by the state or by by businesses or anything like that, then you can't choose. You can't really make choices beyond that as survival either, because you might be free to say that you hate things and not get arrested for it. Sure, that's great, but how can you be truly free if you can't make choices based on all these possible outcomes outside of I have to eat?
Right, exactly. You're still not free.
Exactly. You can't. And and I think this especially becomes the case when you're a very vulnerable person that does need to depend more on others, such as therapists and carers and whatever else that you need. Because if you can't get access to that, you can't actually live an independent life, ironically enough. Like I have access to an occupational therapist. It's very minimal at the moment because I don't have access to the disability insurance program because they say I'm not disabled enough. It's ridiculous. I'm thinking of countering that once I get out. But
right.
I'm planning on moving. And that's only going to be achievable with the help of this therapist to teach me basic living skills that I never got to, because my executive functioning is basically non-existent. I never got to get that help as a kid. My sibling does. The difference shows. And so it's funny, like I'm saying I have
autistic. And we have had the same. So I grew up with someone who had the same problems as me, and he had some coping mechanisms, but not all. So I've grown up lacking a lot of some of the basic how to do your life skills, and I love my partner's patience in me. He's done a lot to teach me how to person, so I definitely empathize with that.
Yeah.
Well,
but no. So for me, like it's sorry, no, I was gonna say, so but if I was living in a purely individualistic type mindset, I would never be able to achieve the level of independence that I can now to be able to soon move out. Because if I had to do everything on my own, I wouldn't be able to do anything.
Right.
I was going to say, I hate to be the bad person here, but for the sake of time, I think we'll have to schedule a part 3 and to come back again to wrap this up. But I do think the sort of...
Oh, no.
I know.
Oh, no, we have to come back again next year?
It's fun.
Damn, I hate doing this. Shucks, guys.
I do think the collective call here for more empathy and more compassion is also, in general, a good place to wrap up the show as well. So I do want to just say...
Be excellent unto each other.
Yes. I do want to say this has been my absolute pleasure to sit here and learn so much from all of you. And this is really an incredible conversation. I'm so happy to have been here for it. So thank you all so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for putting up with me being the angry lady of ranting about Scotland.
We need the angry lady. I'm glad she was here.
We need more angry ladies.
I love Scotland. I'm ranting about the mistreatment of Scotland.
Yeah. See, that was a lot of fun, wasn't it? So before we go, there was something I wanted to say specifically to follow up on this question of what can we do? There were a lot of really wonderfully spoken words of advice around what the individual can do, what the broader government can do, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to kind of come at it from a cognitive science perspective, as I am wont to do. And forgive me for any background noise. My son is awake and playing at the moment. So when it comes to what we can do to provide community support, I think there's a few things we need. I think we need awareness in order to normalize different bodies, but also different ways of being. Kind of going back to what Carol was saying about social contracts being arbitrary. We also need political involvement. I think that was touched on a lot, why that's a relevant need. And we also need to fight bigotry. And I want to explain why fighting bigotry is relevant in general, right? So if we look at transphobia, for example, when J.K. Rowling threw a fit about the term people with uteruses being used in a news article, essentially what she's doing is reducing womanhood to having a uterus, right? So this isn't just transphobic, but it ends up being ableist too, because it's patriarchal in a way that harms women, all women, but cis women as well, because there are cis women who are born without or had their uteruses removed. And so this happens anytime you try and reduce, for example, womanhood to a biological function. There are women with hormone imbalances or who have more what's considered masculine features or who don't have periods or can't have kids, right? So it's important to remember that reducing harm on the marginalized helps everyone. In a similar way, I think fighting racism and colonialism is important. And I'll try and explain that by sticking to the mental health theme here, because reducing racism directly impacts trauma recovery. I think the ways that we teach others to heal from trauma in America, primarily, really, generally is through putting the responsibility on the individual. And the problem is the ongoing trauma people of color experience necessitates community action in order to heal. Right? So this goes back to the political action and general awareness. I'll put some links about this in the show notes because I don't want to go on about this forever. And really, this is a topic where I could do probably an entire hour-long monologue or more on this. But as an example, the way that therapists tend to approach treatment is it's generally run through the lens of evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychology has a whole slew of problems. There's one thing I want to focus on specifically, but interestingly, as I'm recording this, ContraPoints, who I generally like, actually used evolutionary psychology in her most recent video titled Justice, which I think overall was a very good video. And she actually makes a lot of points that I made in a similar video for Patreon, except I was talking about Sophie Lancaster and the philosophy of justice. But she, at one point, or a couple points actually, in the beginning, she talks about the idea of how the desire for revenge evolved through, she uses monkeys as an example. And the problem with evolutionary psychology is it makes specific intuitive sense. And the reason it does is because it puts, it explains phenomena in terms of causal chains. This happened, which caused this to happen, which caused this to happen. And it's an easily digestible heuristic. The reality, though, and again, I won't go into this here because I've talked about this in various ways over this whole year, really. But the reality is always much more complicated. I talk to most primatologists, and they will talk about how Homo sapiens are generally enact behaviors and traits that are conflicting in various species of apes, right? The classic example is bonobo conflict resolution and chimpanzee conflict resolution, whereas chimpanzees resolve conflict through violence, and bonobos, on the other hand, resolve conflict through mutual masturbation. And you can see both of those behaviors being produced in humans. But it's easier to just assume there's a simple chain of causality. So that was just an interesting coincidence, I think, that this came up in her video, which I would still recommend you check out and take a listen to. But what I wanted to talk about, in addition to that, though, was evolutionary psychology is generally run through the massive modularity hypothesis. In brief, the massive modularity hypothesis is essentially the idea that cognition in the human mind is compartmentalized into components, which are specialized in certain types of information, and that the brain and its intrinsic content is the sole seat of cognition. Basically, cognition only happens in the head. So it follows then that the treatment of trauma is through individual care, medication, introspection, and some form of dominance. And the reason this is relevant outside my love of studying cognition is that our understanding of emotional states being controlled in some dominance model, essentially mind over emotion, is an incomplete picture of the human experience that ends up, I think, harming more than helping. A practical example of this, at least for me, every single therapist I've been to, and I think every therapist podcast I've listened to, has at some point brought up this idea that the amygdala is the fear center of the brain, and that your lizard brain will override your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is where your executive function essentially is supposed to exist, and is where you get things like delayed gratification and that kind of thing. So this is really common. I do think this is changing, but this is still pretty pervasive within psychology. So the problem with this system, this dominant system, which is presented as common sense, because again, evolutionary psychology is reductionist in a way that gives it a seemingly a very easy to digest explanatory power. But the way that it's presented perpetuates the idea that anyone with depression can overcome depression through emotional regulation. What this inherently rejects, though, is the idea that cognition is embedded and embodied. And when you have a system that acknowledges how connected our cognition is to our bodies and to our environment, you would say that there can't be true healing without addressing our bodies and our communities. And now, again, I'm going to try and move away from evolutionary psychology because I could go off on it in its own right. For example, if you ask an evolutionary psychologist why men get paid more than women, they would say something like, men get paid more than women because men evolved to be more competitive. So there's a whole slew of issues, but I'll be here all day if I don't shut up. Going back to racism, the way we treat mental health, I think, can harm those who are dealing with generational trauma that is continues to be inflicted. For example, every time someone might see dead black bodies, right? Or just through daily interactions with white people. So when you work on the theory and the assumption, the model that society and the body are two distinct entities, what you do is move the healing process from a communal responsibility back onto the individual who happens to already be suffering. And I think that can prolong rather than reduce suffering. That's why I say all the time that we need to question these essentialist ways of understanding ourselves and adopt a view of the individual and the environment being reciprocally related. Because then if we understand that we are not independent existence, then we are therefore contingent on a web of interaction. If there is no me and you, and we are all concomitant, meaning you can't have one without the other, then being self-interested becomes irrational. And as an ethic, that reduces suffering for everyone. The question I ask myself then is, how do we change that kind of thinking? Because if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know that the way I change my thinking is through academic study and introspection. But that's going to be gibberish for a lot of people. And that's something I really struggle with I'm not a science communicator, right? I like the turgid academic jargon that you have to dig your way through. But that's not everybody. Most people don't care about that, I think. So there's a few ways you can do this. You could do that the way I do it. You could take a bunch of LSD. I mean, honestly, you could. People who take LSD, studies show, and just sort of anecdotally, that you experience feeling connected with everything and being an active participant in the ontological becoming, as much of a participant as any other organism. So that changes the way that you view the world, right? But you can also, I think, help people start moving away from the idea that, for instance, we are our brains with intuition pumps. So I'll just throw a few out here. And again, these aren't philosophical arguments because, and you know what, I'll put a link. I'll put some resources in the show notes for anyone who is really interested. I'll put the more academic stuff towards the bottom and then put some more digestible videos and stuff at the top if you're interested. But you can point out things like we typically gesture when we speak to one another. Okay, so gesturing is facilitating communication and language processing. So that moves cognition beyond just the brain. Or you could point out that we are often able to perform cognitive tasks such as remembering more effectively by using our bodies and even parts of our surrounding environments in order to offload storage and simplify the nature of processing. So my axe to grind here is really that we need to realize everyone depends on everyone else. And when it comes to those that are dealing with difficulties, especially those dealing with difficulties, the solution is not simply to fix the person from the inside out. We have to take responsibility as a community. And really, I think that's the main takeaway. So that's my 2 cents. That's of everything I wanted to say during this episode, I think that's my primary, was going to be my primary focal point. But as always, we have come to the end of the episode. Next month, October 2nd, we will be returning, and we will have special guest Caitlin Doty, who you may know as Ask a Mortician on YouTube or the founder of the Order of the Good Death. And that will be in keeping with our yearly visitation of death and the practical and philosophical experience of death. So I hope you will return for that. As always, I am the Count. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.